Will stronger U.S. relations bolster Iran's liberalization or further empower the religious government? How do you think Americans should think about Iran's future?
Oh, that's a really good one.
Who wrote these?
Yeah. So,
props to the writer.
So first of all, let's talk about the status of U.S. relations with Iran after the Iran deal. Whether you were for or against this nuclear deal, it's really an arms control agreement to try to halt Iran's nuclear weapons development or their capability development for at least a decade. But it doesn't answer the question of which direction U.S.-Iran relations will go in more broadly. There are some who believe that this nuclear agreement will pave the way for the removal of economic sanctions, which is happening by and large, and an opening economically of Iran to Western investment and so forth, and that this will gradually be supportive to the more moderate elements in Iran and will gradually open up the society and create the conditions where the Iranian people, who are actually very pro-Western and very interested in integrating to the global economy, will, manage to choose a different kind of regime. It's a wonderful theory. Maybe it will happen over a very long period of time. But I think this is where you need a clear-eyed assessment. This regime in Iran is still actively today supporting terrorism across the region, whether it's Hezbollah in Lebanon or sort of proxies that are trying to undermine Sunni regimes in the region. They've deployed militias throughout Iraq and Syria. It's a regime that's still committed to spreading revolution, a very extremist version of Shia orthodoxy. And so I think until that changes and until there's further political evolution inside Iran, it's hard to see this fundamental realignment that some talked about in terms of Iran becoming the United States' closest partner in the region. I don't think that's likely to happen until you have fundamental change in the behavior in the regime and probably in the nature of that regime. So I think long-term, Iran is one of the most dynamic populations. I think Iran has a great future long-term for reintegration in the Middle East. I think in the short to near, in the near to mid-term, we're still dealing with a very repressive regime that doesn't show any signs of changing its stripes.
Yeah, I mean, one of my criticisms of the deal is that I felt that the agreement, rather than being a boon to the moderates, was a lease on life for the worst elements of the regime. And the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards Corps, among other things, is the biggest economic enterprise in Iran. And so the entity that will be benefiting economically from lifting of sanctions will be IRGC-controlled companies. The great question, I mean, a number of people brought up the fact that, when the Nixon administration opened China, it was still a heinous regime. It was run by Mao. It was just coming off. In fact, it was still in the midst of the Cultural Revolution. Kissinger and Nixon shook hands with the devil. I mean, Mao Zedong is up there with Hitler and Stalin as one of the great killers of the 20th century. And yet China moved gradually in the direction, I mean, now it's moving backwards, but it did have this extraordinary period of liberalization, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and opening to the world. So the question is, okay, you make a deal with the Khamenei's regime, but he won't be alive forever. He'll die. Rouhani seems much more reasonable. And maybe we will be in a similar evolutionary pattern where you set the groundwork for openings. Who knows? As Niels Bohr said, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. But I suspect that's the cases are different. When China made its deal with the US, A, it was profoundly threatened by the Soviet Union. It felt like a loser. And B, it started making the kind of noises, sometimes symbolically, that you want from a country that indicates it wants a rapprochement, famously the ping pong tournaments. You know, what Iran does after doing the deal is it takes Americans hostages. And there's still Americans who are hostage in Iran. And, you know, they released a bunch of hostages and then they took more hostages. So that's not a very promising sign of how the regime sees the agreement, not an agreement that's simply a benefit to it. But I think the regime thinks that it hoodwinked the United States or got the better of the United States. And by the way, that's the assessment not just of Israelis, but of every Sunni regime in the region. We'll find out. And no one would be happier than me to find out in 5 or 10 years that Obama had it right. This gave us the space we needed. Iran moved in a better direction. It never acquires nuclear weapons. We never have to go to war with them. I fear that's not what's going to happen. But, you know,
I think the jury's out.
The jury's out.
Yeah.
All right. Who's next?
A short question. Is it time for the U.S. to abandon Saudi Arabia?
No. No.